Thank you, Steve, for your very kind words about me. I am indeed very happy to be here with all of you to talk about one of the raging issues in India today, which is this whole corruption campaign. I noticed that there are a number of foreign students here from China and some from the US, and therefore I'll try to explain the context so that everybody can understand what's really going on in India. A lot of what's going on in India, I'm sure, is also going on in other parts of the world. It will have its resonance, and I'm sure that all of you can pick up the commonalities with your own countries. In order to understand the anti-corruption movement, which is currently become a very big movement in India, we need to have some understanding of this whole, the breadth, the depth, the effects of corruption, and indeed move back a little bit further and see the connections between corruption and the state of Indian society. Some of you, particularly those who are from China, I'm sure that in your country too you are told that China has become an economic superpower, that the growth rate in China has gone up to whatever 10%. The same is being claimed by the government of India about India, that we have made tremendous progress, particularly since economic liberalization. Growth rate has gone up enormously, the GDP growth rate, and India is also on its way to becoming an economic superpower. But if you try and scratch the surface and see, look a little beneath the surface to see what is the state of people, of the majority of the people in the country, common people in the country, particularly those who live in rural areas, and the state of Indian society, the picture that you find is quite different. What you find is that on the one hand there is a large majority of the country are still living in grinding poverty. In fact, 78% of India's population is supposed to be surviving on less than 20 rupees a day. 20 rupees a day means that you cannot even buy 2 square meals a day with that money, let alone anything for your housing, education, healthcare, transportation, etc. You also find that 200,000 people, particularly farmers, have committed suicide in the last 10 years. 200,000 farmers committing suicide due to economic distress. You also find a number of very serious social conflicts which have been growing up in the country, particularly armed insurgency by people who call themselves the Maoists, who are people who want a total economic revolution in the country and who want to virtually overthrow the state, which they feel is incapable of being reformed by democratic methods. This is the Maoists are ultra left or a left organization which feel that the economic policies need to be radically restructured. Now, if you want to understand the connection between all these problems that have cropped up and corruption, to what extent corruption has played a role in creating these kind of problems. I can do no better than give you an example or a case study of mining of mineral resources in the country. Now, at one level, prior to economic liberalization, see, India embarked on a process of economic liberalization in 1991, which is also known as the Structural Adjustment Program. And the three components, or the three major components of this program are called liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And in fact, the main thrust of this economic liberalization has been privatization. The underlying theme was that leave everything to the market. Therefore, the government must get out of economic activities. The public sector must be reduced, and everything should be left to the private sector and the market. As a result of this economic liberalization program, one of the things that was done was that natural resources were also handed over to private corporations for exploitation. Not only that, private monopolies, state-mandated private monopolies were created in electricity distribution, water distribution, the management of airports, etc. Now, the result of this policy of allowing the exploitation of natural resources by private corporations has led to a situation where, on the one hand, you can see GDP growth as a result of this activity of mining of mineral resources. In fact, if you allow unbridled mining of mineral resources, you can have any amount of GDP growth in the country, because the capital value of these assets is enormous. And if you allow private corporations to mine it for just profit, they can exploit them and remove them in a very short time, leading to very high GDP growth. In fact, so it can help GDP growth, but in order to see whether it is helping the people of the country, let us see what happens. So you have mineral resources worth, let's say, $1 trillion. The bauxite reserves of Odisha have been estimated at $2.2 trillion. Now, if you gave it away to private mining corporations for mining them, they could exploit and remove them in 20 years, leading to about 8% GDP growth just on account of this sector alone, that is mining of bauxite from this one state. However, how does this GDP growth help the people of the country? Now, some people, it is said, are provided jobs in these mining corporations, but the number of people who get jobs are always less than the number of people who are displaced as a result of getting to those mineral reserves. Most of these mineral reserves are in forest areas where also the tribals live, and you have to first displace these tribals in order to get to those mineral resources. Then you have to cut the trees, because these are mostly forest areas. You have to deforest that place. Often the mineral reserves, the bauxite for example, is the source of rivers of that area because it's a major aquifer, so it destroys the sources of the rivers, and it also pollutes the water bodies and also causes air pollution. And of course, on top of that, you are depleting the mineral reserves of the country. In fact, recently there was a very major report on the state of iron ore mining in the state of Karnataka, and the reports pointed out that if mining of iron ore is allowed at the present rate, it would mean that iron ore in Karnataka, which is the richest iron ore bearing area of the country, would be exhausted in less than 20 years, which means during this generation itself. What does the country get out of it? The public exchequer used to get 27 rupees a ton for iron ore by way of royalty, which was less than 0.5% of the price at which iron ore was being sold. It was being exported mostly to China at 6,000 rupees a ton. The cost of mining was 300 rupees a ton, the cost of extraction of the mineral average cost. The cost of transporting it to the port was another 300 rupees a ton, which meant that on your cost you were getting, which was 600 rupees a ton, you were getting a price of 6,000 rupees a ton by way of selling it, which meant a profit of 900%. And in the process, you had displaced a very large number of tribal people who were dependent on this land for their survival and their livelihoods, and who obviously tried to save this land from being taken away from them, and therefore there are a large number of resistance movements going on across the country of people, particularly indigenous people, who are trying to save their lands from being appropriated by the government for being given to these mining corporations. Now, when these resistance movements are faced, the government often uses force to evict them, and that results in a situation where some of these people then decide to pick up arms and join the Maoists, who are fighting an armed rebellion against the state in the country, which has really exacerbated, which has increased the strength of the Maoists in the country. Now, why have these policies of allowing commercial exploitation of the natural wealth of the country for profit been adopted? If you are going to have a situation where, because mining leases have been given to these mining corporations arbitrarily without any transparency to whosoever the government wanted. In fact, a few years ago, some 200 mining leases were given by the states of Chhattisgarh, Odisha and Jharkhand. These are the three tribal states where indigenous people live. Almost overnight to a large number of mining corporations without any transparency. So if you adopt policies where huge amounts of capital assets can be transferred to private hands without transparency to whosoever you please, and they can derive a 900% profit on the activity of extraction of mineral resources and pay the government a royalty of only 1%, then you have a tailor-made situation where you have created a huge incentive for corruption. So these policies were adopted for corrupt considerations because corporations who wanted these resources bribed politicians to open up the mineral resources for exploitation by private companies for profit. And they have built in huge incentives for increasing corruption. So the same thing happened in the privatization of public sector corporations. Corporations which just land and cash in the bank worth 16,000 crores like the Indian IPCL, Indian Pharmaceutical, Indian Petrochemicals Limited. That was handed over to a private corporation for just 10% of the price of just their real estate and cash in bank. So, again, this process has created huge incentives for corruption, because if you have such a huge profit, that is 90% of the capital asset was your profit, then out of that you could pay any amount, even half of that, to these public servants, ministers, etc., who handed over that asset to you. And this is indeed what has been happening. So as a result of this, this GDP growth has created a situation where, on the one hand, you have created a huge social problem. This GDP growth, as a result of allowing exploitation of natural resources and capital assets of the country by private corporations, has created a situation where you have, on the one hand, created a huge social problem, on the other hand, devastated the environment, destroyed the forests, etc. Thirdly, you have very quickly finished off the natural wealth, that is the mineral resources of the country. And on top of that, you have created this mafia, these people who have amassed huge amounts of money, which are, this Ambani, one of the big corporate honchos in India, has built a home for where just two people are supposed to live for $1 billion in Bombay. So you have created these sort of monsters in the country who have become so powerful because of this huge amounts of money that they have, that they sit on top of the entire ruling establishment of the country. And you have created huge incentives for corruption. You have created a whole corrupt set of public servants, ministers, and so on. So these policies, you see, privatization, that is just transfer of capital assets. These policies created a new kind of business, which was transferring capital assets from public to private hands arbitrarily for a song, as a result of which huge incentives have been created for corruption, and that has resulted in a situation where corruption during the period of economic liberalization in the country has increased many fold. Simultaneously, and as I said, you see, corruption has three kinds of impacts. Firstly, of course, it takes away money and assets from the public exchequer, which could be used for providing healthcare, education, etc. to the poor people in the country. On the other hand, it has the effect of distorting public policies. So for corrupt considerations, public policies are adopted which are not in public interest, but which are in the commercial interest of these corporations who are in a position to bribe public officials. And lastly, they end up creating this corrupt mafia in the country, which is a great threat to democracy and public institutions. Now this is, as I said, talking about the factors which have created huge incentives for corruption, why corruption grew so much. Simultaneously, nothing was done to stop or to create any disincentives for corruption or to strengthen the anti-corruption institutions in the country. Now, if we look at three of the most important anti-corruption institutions in the country, one is the Central Bureau of Investigation, which is supposed to investigate corruption of central public servants. The Central Vigilance Commission, which is supposed to exercise vigilance over central public servants and take disciplinary action against those who misconduct themselves or who indulge in corruption. And the judiciary, which is supposed to try these corrupt public servants and send them to jail. What you find is that the Central Bureau of Investigation has a built-in conflict of interest because it is administratively controlled by the very people whom it is supposed to investigate. So the same ministers who are to be investigated for corruption by the Central Bureau of Investigation have administrative control over it, and therefore they are not able to freely and fearlessly investigate these ministers or even some of the other senior civil servants. And since there is corruption there which cannot be tackled and they have administrative control, they are not even in a position to check corruption within the Central Bureau of Investigation if those officers become corrupt, because of this, again, conflict of interest. So you have allowed that situation to continue and not rectified it, and that is why this whole movement for an ombudsman, for an independent anti-corruption ombudsman in India called the Lokpal, is for the creation of an institution which will investigate and prosecute public servants for corruption and which would be functionally, financially, as well as in its method of selection completely independent of the government, of the executive government which it is supposed to investigate for corruption. It would be a separate statutory body. The Central Vigilance Commission was given functional autonomy by means of a legislation called the CVC Act, but its selection was still left to the government. So we have a selection committee consisting of the Prime Minister, the Home Minister and the Leader of Opposition who selects the Central Vigilance Commissioners. Now, usually the Leader of Opposition who has been a minister in the past and hopes to become the Prime Minister in the future also wants a weak and pliable watchdog, because that will also investigate the Leader of Opposition's own acts of corruption, if there have been any, while he was in office or while he hopes to become the Prime Minister. And that is why we have seen a succession of weak and pliable people being appointed to these positions. The judiciary has two problems. Firstly, the cases there don't get decided for decades altogether, so when public servants are prosecuted for corruption, the prosecutions linger on, then the appeals linger on until that public servant dies. So until that time he is out on bail and therefore they are not brought to book. Secondly, the judiciary itself has become fairly corrupt, and that is because the higher judiciary, that is the High Court and the Supreme Court, have no accountability to anyone at all. So they are a law unto themselves. Nobody can hold them accountable for any kind of misconduct or corruption. And therefore, they have become corrupt, and therefore they have even allowed the lower judiciary to become corrupt, over which they do have administrative control. But if you are yourself corrupt, you will not be able to exercise any disciplinary control over your subordinates. So that is why the need arose and this demand arose for a Lokpal or an independent ombudsman. Now, I'll talk about some of the main provisions of this bill. But before I do that, this anti-corruption movement. You see, in India in the last 6 months or so, or rather in the last 1 year or so, there has been this sort of major anti-corruption movement which has taken shape, which is spearheaded by a small group of people which are also called Team Anna or the team of Anna Hazare, led by this old septuagenarian Gandhian type of, not Gandhian, I would say, a person who had been involved in village development in his area, but who is wedded to the principles of non-violence, who spearheaded this movement. And the central thrust of this movement was to ask for a particular piece of legislation which would put in place an independent anti-corruption authority which would be fully empowered, fully independent of the government, fully empowered to investigate and prosecute corrupt public servants, and fully accountable as well to ensure that it also does not become corrupt. The reason why this movement received such a huge response from people in the country, because it received a huge support, unprecedented support. This has created a movement which has not been seen in the country, at least for the last 35 years, was firstly because of the fact that corruption had become such a serious, widespread problem affecting everybody. Recently there had been a number of very highly publicized big corruption scams which had erupted, which the media had publicized a great deal. Secondly, there was a team which was leading this movement, which was seen as a credible team by the people of the country. And lastly, they were offering a tangible solution for the problem. If you compare this with the Wall Street movement, you find that the Wall Street movement does not offer, though the issue that they have identified is a very, very important issue. In as much as they are saying that we need to reduce or remove the influence of these large corporations, particularly financial firms, over the government. That today these firms in particular are influencing economic policies in particular and other policies in general of the government and inducing them, and influencing them in a direction which is for their commercial interest and not in general public interest. Exactly what is happening in India and perhaps exactly what is happening in many parts of the world. So this movement has created a resonance among large sections of society. But unfortunately, since this movement is led by a very a large set of amorphous people who have not been together in any movement before and who have not been together in an organization before, they have not been able to articulate a clear solution for this problem. They have identified the problem correctly, but they have not articulated a clear solution, unlike what happened in India, where a solution was articulated and pushed for, and therefore that also gave a huge impetus to this movement. Now, very briefly, we have tried to, the legislation that we are proposing, which is called the Lokpal Bill, not only puts in place this kind of independent authority which is fully empowered and fully accountable, there are also a couple of other measures that is the corruption by way of allowing revolving doors between financial firms, other private corporations, other institutions and the government. This revolving door between Wall Street firms and the government, so most of the treasury secretaries would have come from these Wall Street firms and go back there after they cease to be treasury secretaries, and so on. This has led to a kind of legalized corruption of public policies in the US as well as in India. We have sought to close this door, this revolving door, by a provision in this bill that no public servant who has ever dealt with any private entity can take up a job, consultancy or assignment of any kind with that private entity after that. So therefore, that seeks to close this door for legalized corruption, which has also had an enormous corrupting influence on public policies, because naturally people who are looking at post-retirement jobs with private corporations would tend to, when they are in office as public servants, would tend to push for policies which help those corporations if they are looking for jobs with them. And this is what has happened. This is what has been happening. Another measure that we have built into the bill is that no lease, license, contract or any other form of largesse will be given by any public authority without a transparent public auction. This will also help to stop this kind of rent seeking that we are seeing by way of granting of mining leases, etc. So, of course, today the government unfortunately brought a very different bill in Parliament which has all kinds of problems. It creates an ombudsman which is selected by the government and which is also controlled by the government, because they have the power to suspend members of this local authority by just making a complaint against them to the Supreme Court. There are also various other problems with the government's bill. The bill is now being discussed in the parliamentary committee where they are hearing the views of different people. However, by now it has become clear to everybody, including those in government, that the bill that we have proposed enjoys enormous public support. At least 80% of the people in the country support the Jan Lokpal bill. This has been shown by every opinion poll or every referendum which has been held in the country. And therefore the government has come to realize that they will have to pay a heavy political price if they are seen to be opposing this kind of bill. And therefore hopefully it will be modified and brought more in line with the bill that we have proposed when it is eventually voted upon, discussed and voted upon in Parliament in the next session, which would be in November, December. However, irrespective of what happens to this bill or this piece of legislation, what this anti-corruption movement has achieved in India is something far more important, which is that it has galvanized and mobilized and brought out on the streets a very large section of Indian society, particularly young people, who had thus far become cynical, helpless, and started feeling hopeless. Suddenly, because of this movement, they started feeling that if they participate in this movement, perhaps they will be able to change something in India. And they felt that they need to come out and participate in this movement to change, to bring about this kind of change in terms of this kind of legislation. This is, to my mind, the major achievement of this movement and this campaign, that it has created a feeling of hope, of positive patriotism among people in the country, that they need to come out and engage with public issues in order to improve things in the country. And they feel that yes, they can make a difference. Going forward from here, of course, what happens to this bill is important, but there are other major issues confronting the country. There are structural injustices in the form of laws and policies which allow the government to appropriate the land and resources of the poorest people in the country and hand them over to the richest corporations. These structural problems in terms of laws and policies cannot be handled by this local body unless one can prove that they have been done as a result of a bribe. Very often it is not possible to prove that. These structural injustices in the shape of these policies, like the laws like the Special Economic Zone Act, which also allows the government to appropriate the lands of people or poor farmers for giving it essentially for real estate development to large corporations. These have to be fought either by having separate movements on each of these issues or by changing the nature or the manner in which democracy functions in the country. And this is the real challenge for the future. Today we have a form of representative democracy both in India as well as in the US, where we elect our representatives once in a few years, and then those representatives decide what kind of major decisions are to be taken, what kind of laws and policies are to be made. Though in the US there are some states which do allow for a process of referendum for deciding certain things, but essentially at the federal level, all decisions, important decisions, policies and laws are made by these so-called elected representatives. And we have found that they can easily be corrupted either by way of bribing them directly or by way of this kind of legalized corruption that we are seeing in the shape of revolving doors or other kind of influence peddling. So, in order to change this, because democracy does not mean rule by the representatives of the people. Democracy means rule by the people. Why can the people not directly decide what kind of decisions, what kind of policies, what kind of laws need to be made? Why can't that power be given to the people directly? Why can't you have a referendum to decide what kind of local bill must be passed or must be enacted for the country? Why should it be left only to those 500 or 800 elected representatives who sit in parliament? You can certainly ascertain the views and the wishes of the people by means of a referendum. All the contentious issues around the bill could be segregated, framed in a fair and neutral manner, and put to the vote of the people, and on the basis of whatever the people vote or want, the bill could be framed. There are several challenges for making this kind of, or for effectuating this kind of participatory or direct democracy. The first challenge is that you need to have some authority, some neutral authority, who can decide what are the main options which have been put on the table and frame them in a fair and neutral manner, because a lot depends on how the questions are framed, how the issues are framed. The second is that some of the issues must be taken as a package. For example, somebody asked me yesterday at an NPR interview that, but if you put this question of whether taxes should be raised to a referendum, obviously everybody will say that no, taxes should not be raised. But then you don't put that issue on a standalone basis. You say, look, if taxes are raised, we can do this with the money that we derive from those taxes. That is, we can provide better health care, educational services. On the other hand, if we don't raise taxes, our services will remain as they are. So you put the packages before the people that, look, do you want higher taxes and better educational and health services, or do you want lower taxes and no health or educational services? These are the choices before you. And therefore, on that basis, it could be put to vote. So you have to decide what things cannot be disaggregated and therefore have to be voted on as a package, and what things can be disaggregated and can be voted upon separately. Then you have to reduce the number of available choices to a manageable number. You can't have people voting on a very large range of choices. Again, a neutral authority could be empowered, or some kind of primary type of system could be used to eliminate the peripheral choices, and then the main choices could be put to vote. Therefore, once you institute this kind of participatory or direct democracy, you will avoid this kind of corporate capture of democracy by means of bribing, influence peddling. That is not to say that this will be without problem still. Noam Chomsky in his book Manufacturing Consent has pointed out how large corporations using just their money power and advertising etc. can influence even public opinion and thus manufacture consent in their favor. So therefore, even if all the people were voting on a particular issue, there would still be these influences of money by the corporations. But that would still be a much better system than the present system of representative democracy. Some people have asked, but people don't understand, many of these issues are very complex. How can you expect common people to understand these issues? That's true. Many of these issues, including the Lokpal bill, will not be understood by many people. But then, some of those who don't understand it will not vote at all. Others who don't understand it will vote on the basis of who they trust, which expert they trust. If they feel that there are 3 or 4 experts who are saying different things, they will go on the basis of whose opinion they trust. Even while choosing your representatives, you don't often know who your representatives are, and you vote on the basis of the political party to which they belong. So that will still be a better system than the present system of representative democracy, and that's really the real challenge for the country that I see going ahead. Can we, and do we have the imagination and the boldness to move towards a system of a more participatory form of democracy, or do we still, of course, those who today control the establishment, who are these so-called elected representatives, we have seen that even the nature of elections has become such, at least in India, that it is virtually impossible for honest people who are committed to public welfare to get elected in this system. Only those parties or candidates belonging to those parties which have enormous sums of money through which they can advertise themselves across the country, have an army of paid workers working for them across the country, only they have a credible chance of getting elected in the present system of elections. Perhaps the same holds true for the US as well. So, we need to change that. We need to, but as I said, those who are sitting in power today, they have a vested interest in retaining the present corrupted system of representative democracy. And therefore they will resist it by every means at their command. And for that we will need an bigger people's movement than the one that we saw on this issue of this ombudsman or the corruption in this corruption campaign. We need to really exercise enormous direct people's power on the persons who are today sitting in the ruling establishment, who are today our representatives, in the same manner in which this influence was exercised in this whole Lokpal movement in India. Whatever legislation is being brought despite those in power not wanting to bring that. Because they have realized that if they do not do what this whole people who are behind this movement, who are supporting this movement are asking them to do, they will suffer very serious electoral consequences in the future. And that kind of movement, or an even bigger movement, needs to be built. And I hope that this Wall Street movement here is not only able to articulate a set of very specific solutions that they are proposing, but they will also take up this larger issue of moving towards a more participatory form of democracy. Otherwise, we will have to struggle, as we have in this corruption movement, on each and every single issue to change the laws and policies and bring about the laws and policies that we want. As I said, the most important achievement of this campaign has been this energizing of people and getting them activated. The challenge going forward is to keep these people engaged in these other major public issues and bring their voices to bear on making those changes as well. If we can maintain and increase this public participation of people on public issues, then we have created a real revolution in the country. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Q&A. We'll do about half an hour of Q&A session here. So we'll rotate the mics. I think you have a level mic. Why don't you use this one? Okay. Good.
Yeah.
We'll use it and then we'll circulate these mics around here. Why don't you, let's do one here and one on this side. Yeah. You stay on this side.
Prashantji, I have several questions. One is one most of the detail. I read the UN Convention in great detail at least 3 to 4 times. I understand that the Lokpal bill has been framed with that as the background. I also understand why you have had to minimize it, because the minimized version itself has so much fight there. Certain aspects like the whistleblower protection and the non-money involved corruption. I think even convention talks about how a senior official calling a junior official and telling him to do or not to do is also corruption and so on. Now that it's not a part of the current bill, what do you see as the scope for all of those to make into our laws? Will it take 10 years, 20 years?
We have put in whatever we considered was minimally necessary. In addition, we put in these couple of provisions that I mentioned. We have also put in measures which are not there in our present laws for confiscating the property of the public servants
the judiciaries in Madhya Pradesh. They found that the government had sanctioned several lakhs of rupees to attend a wedding for the judges. 10 judges to go attend the wedding of the secretary. They made an excuse like high court judges coming there, and so all these low-level judges need to go to the event, and they had gone there. If you see, this also shows the thing where even though judiciary is an independent body, finally they are still dependent on the main mechanism. You know, right from their security, their car, everything finally comes back from the same people against whom they have to rule. How, not just in the local perspective, shouldn't independent bodies have total independence wherein that principal secretary shouldn't have any role in making a decision for them in this financial aspect? You see, almost every judge made about 25,000 to 50,000 rupees. That's a big amount. That's indirectly the government is bribing them.
Yeah, no, you are right that we need to eliminate even this kind of influence or largesse that the government can give to these judges. But at the same time, you see, if we make all these things within the purview of the judiciary, we need to also make them accountable. Today, unfortunately, as I said, there is no accountability of the higher judiciary. The judiciary has been saying that we cannot be made accountable to anybody outside ourselves. We can only have self-accountability, and self-accountability we have seen doesn't work. It's the biggest conflict of interest. It's an oxymoron to say that one must be accountable only to oneself. Therefore, we have given the Lokpal a limited kind of accountability over the higher judiciary by providing that at least the investigation for corruption of members of the higher judiciary could be done by the Lokpal, because the Lokpal is not only independent of the government, it is also independent of the judiciary. But unfortunately, even this is being resisted by the judiciary and therefore by the government also, which wants to keep the judiciary happy and play ball with them. So therefore, even this has not been brought, the judiciary has been exempted from the purview of the Lokpal and the government's bill. But we certainly need a completely independent judicial conduct commission for holding the judges accountable for misconduct also and for removing them. In our bill, the Lokpal cannot remove judges, but they can prosecute them for corruption. In my view, the Lokpal can also be given the authority to remove, to order the removal of judges. But there was so much resistance from judges, even from retired judges, that we did not give that power. For that, an independent judicial conduct commission would have to be set up.
Short follow-up question.
Let's take one question and come back. Go ahead, sir.
This is more about the awareness, spreading awareness. When the movement was at its peak, we have seen mostly people from the towns and cities participating in the movement. But we haven't seen this kind of participation from the villages where the real vote bank is there for the political parties. So do you have any plan in place to spread the awareness? And that's number one question. Number two is about your including the judiciary, where the team Anna has agreed finally with the government's wish that the judiciary should be exempt from the general hall. So to cover the judiciary, do you have any other procedure or plan in place?
To answer your second question first, to cover the judiciary, we are saying that we have no objection to another independent judicial conduct commission being set up for investigating the judges as well as for removing them for misconduct, provided that that body is completely independent of the government as well as of the judiciary, and provided that that legislation comes along with the Lokpal legislation. Unfortunately, we are not seeing any signs of that happening because the Judicial Commission bill which the government had brought, that's a totally useless bill. Firstly, there is no authority to investigate and prosecute judges for corruption in that. Secondly, the scrutiny committee, etc., that is created by that bill is full of judges of the same High Court or the same court. So it has inbuilt conflicts of interest. So for that we will have to wage another battle to get that through. About taking this issue to the villages, some attempts are being made. It's true that there is lesser awareness among the villages in the rural areas about this whole Lokpal than there is in the urban areas, and it needs to be improved. So some attempts are being made within the limits of the capacity of this movement.
You had a question?
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for sharing information and observations. My question was for the forward part of the presentation on the development part, which then tied to the corruption, which is twofold. One is the Maoist movement that you mentioned, the work, the reasons for joining, which is about 95% indigenous people of India, there are Adivasis that are part of that. That directly, both in the protests and the photos or people who are involved in writing the legislation, there's not any direct correlation or any way of including that in how they directly can actually get anything out of this bill. And do you really think that anti-corruption bill will be affecting or reducing the amount of people that join the Maoist movement? That's the first goal. The second thing I think you kind of draw a little bit into, which is the tension between development in India versus growth. It's 10% for the 50 and above percent population versus the below. And when you kind of split it up, there's anti-corruption stuff happening, and there's a movement for against SEZ or whatever else. How do you see that coming together, working together to that?
Yeah, you see, this issue of what is inducing the tribals to join the Maoists is not necessarily directly related to corruption. It's what I call a kind of structural injustice that is taking place in the country, where certain laws and policies have been put in place which have allowed the government, even without necessarily corruption, to appropriate even without direct corruption by way of bribery, to appropriate the lands of the tribals for large corporations. This needs to be addressed. Of course, Anazare has mentioned that one way to address this is to give the power, and he has said that this would be part of our movement going forward. That one of our demands would be that the decision to acquire land cannot be taken by the government in Delhi or in the state capital, but by the total collective of adults of that area of which the land is being acquired. So if the land of a particular village is being acquired, all the adults of that village have to consent, or the majority of the adults of that village have to give consent for that land acquisition. And without that, it cannot be done. So, this is certainly on the agenda, though it is not directly related to this, or not directly related to this ombudsman or the anti-corruption legislation. It would have to be taken up separately by way of amending the Land Acquisition Act. So, structural injustices apart from corruption which also need to be addressed by means of changing those laws and policies.
No, Prashant, thank you for that amazing lecture. My question is actually related to your vision of democracy, and I followed as much as one can from Chicago, the entire movement the second time round. And I was just kind of surprised. It seems like all of the energy is connected to the grassroots really strongly. But the vision that you just outlined of democracy seems to not take into context the fact that we still continue to have a literacy rate which doesn't mean 100%, 25% people who are illiterate. The education level has about 20% people who are just below the fifth grade. So, the level of participation is a function of how much information you have and the capabilities of information processing that you have. So, the two single most important legislations that have come out of India, the Information Act, Right to Information Act, and the Panchayati Raj movement. I think their success was largely because of the context, they took the context into account. People were able to access information and use that and continue to, and the Panchayati Raj movement. The kind of democracy plan that you foresee of the level of information, I think the corruption or the misinformation or the misuse of power in the structure would be very similar to the one that we have. Is there a way that you could modify your visions as part of GMR as an activist that would make it more likely to have a lasting impact and not have the outcomes like the ones we're seeing in Arab Spring? Like you said, AMA stands for the non-violent aspect of movement, and the kind of far-reaching state-level changes that you're asking are very different from changes in government functioning or the kind of government that we want. Which is why we could clarify, are we looking at change in the structure of the state itself or change in the way our democratically elected governments function?
What I was talking about is changing the very nature of democracy. Meaning, today we have a form of representative democracy, where we just elect our representatives and then they take all the decisions which are going to affect everybody. From that, we want to move to a system where the people at large, all the stakeholders, have a direct role in the framing of those policies or laws or in the taking of those decisions which are going to affect them. So, it's true that in this, there are people who are illiterate also, and there would be those who may not be able to understand many of these issues which come up before them. But I mean, that is an unavoidable problem. What I am saying is that at least this system that I am proposing, that we are proposing, which is let the people at large who are the stakeholders who are going to be affected by any decision, let them all take that decision rather than only a few elected representatives who were elected some years ago, who may not have been elected to represent the people on this issue. In any case, you see, if the people who are illiterate, if they trust these elected representatives, they can ask them, look, which way do you think we should vote on this issue? And they will vote according to them, so they will vote on the basis of whom they trust if they don't understand the issue. But at least this will be a much better, more democratic system, much less likely to be corrupted or captured by these commercial vested interests than the present system that we have.
Did you have a question?
Thank you, Prashant, for coming here. I wish that more people were like you. Actually, I feel that I should be more like you. And so my question is regarding not the establishment, but the people in general. How important is it to
increase the morals of the people in general. Like when there is an election, less than 50% of the people come up to vote. Or when it's a case that the policeman catches a person, that person is very likely to do a crime. So how important is it to raise the general moral of the people? And is that an integral part of the kind of democracy that we are proposing? Because for the stakeholders to take action on the important issues of the nation, the stakeholders have to be responsible and they should care enough to be taking action.
So that's what we are saying. That the good thing about this movement was that a lot of people who were earlier not participating in public issues or public affairs at all, and who were content or resigned to allowing these elected representatives to decide everything for them, now came out and expressed themselves on at least this issue of the Lokpal bill. We need to increase this kind of public engagement of people at large in public issues of our time.
I have two questions for you. One is that, well, first of all, a brief comment. It is the first time that the IAC India Against Corruption movement has created some kind of a public awareness against corruption. Never before it has happened. Now, considering the fact that this widespread corruption has taken a deep root, and you are up against elements who was vested interest in maintaining this corruption with national and international connection. Whereas IAC is a relatively new movement with a limited number of people, well-meaning people who has experience in different areas, but it is not likely that they have experience in dealing with the kind of elements who are responsible for corruption. What do you intend to do? I mean, how do you foresee that this movement, that this IAC movement, India Against Corruption movement, where is it leading to? Where it is leading to itself? That's one question. And the second question, you also mentioned that 70% of the Indian population is living below poverty line. And the awareness that has been created by IAC is, you mentioned the young people have participated. It is our understanding that it is a young, middle-class, English-speaking population that has participated. How many of those 70% people who live below poverty line, how many of them you have been able to mobilize? These are my two questions.
No, it is true that there has been a much larger mobilization among the urban middle classes for this movement as compared to the poor in the country. And therefore, that should increase. I mean, our attempt throughout has been to take this message as far and wide as possible within the constraints of our own resources. Of course, the media has helped to a very large extent in spreading this message, amplifying this message. And our dealing with the politicians is also in the same way. I mean, we have been just using public mobilization. I mean, what we have found is that the government has not succeeded, so the corrupt vested interests have not succeeded despite their various attempts. They have not succeeded in damaging or destroying this movement. They have made various attempts, but mostly those attempts have backfired. But a word of caution here, you see, one should not expect this movement or this group, this team Anna, to continue to lead the country on every issue or on all these issues. This group has come together on this issue of corruption. They were not people who had been working together for a very long time, who had been part of one organization for a very long time, so that they had evolved a common ideology on a whole range of issues. issues, common thinking on a whole range of issues, had been working together on a whole range of issues. That's not the case. They have come together quickly on this one issue. And thus far, for a group who had come together with different experiences, different backgrounds, different ideologies, and to be able to work and achieve whatever we have been able to achieve is itself very, very significant and enormous. But one should not expect that this group, for this team Anna, will continue to lead the fight on all issues, etc. Ultimately, this fire which has been lit by this movement in the hearts and minds of ordinary people, that they can do things to change, they can do something to change the future of the country, that fire needs to be spread. And locally, leadership will emerge from all parts of the country who will take charge locally, and that itself has its own dynamics which will change things. The key is whether we can continue and enlarge this public engagement in public issues that this movement has created to other issues as well in the country. If we can do that, then, as I said, we would have achieved a great deal.
Right.
So, even though we are doubtful that the bill will be passed in winter session, let's assume that if it gets passed, the implementation is also a very big part of it. How can we make sure that it will be implemented correctly and then people can take benefit of it?
Yeah. First, of course, the Lokpal institution will need to be set up. It will take some time for it to be set up. Thereafter, these investigations, etc., will start. The implementation, the successful implementation of this bill and the successful functioning of the Lokpal institution will depend, again, to a large extent on the continued public engagement and public vigilance over this institution. With so much interest having been created, we expect that a great deal of, a very large number of people would be exercising vigilance over this functioning of this institution and do whatever they can to ensure that it works properly. At least we hope so.
I have a short question about the very short-term goal of this movement. Is that, say, by November, personally, I don't feel the government will pass it because they will not sign their own truce deal. Now, the thing is, so how united these people are? Because we are getting like conflicting statements from different parts of people, and truly speaking, what you are saying, the galvanizing the youth and everything. If you take examples from history. For example, 1989 movement in China was very easily destroyed by putting the lollipop of capitalism in front of the Chinese students who started the movement in Tiananmen Square and everything because they got completely distracted. And similar kind of thing will happen. So my question is that because people, as you said, that people believed in you guys because they thought that you were tangible to them, you have good reputations and all these things. But then the statements are coming, for example, I'm just not a personal statement. Like one day I'm opening up a newspaper, I see that Justice Santanu Hegde is giving some kind of statement, or let's say Arvind Kejriwal is giving some kind of statement, or that you are giving some kind of statement. And things are just people who are aware, who Google, who read online newspaper, blog, they will very easily get distracted.
Yeah. So this movement or the team Anna is united on the issue of the Jan Lokpal bill. On that there is no disagreement. However, the team members, as I said, have come from different backgrounds, different ideologies, different experiences. They are not going to have a common view on every issue. And it is not possible for people like, for example, me. I have been working on a very large number of issues, not just the issue of corruption. Corruption has been one of the major areas of my interest. But I have been working on human rights, for example, civil liberties, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. I have been campaigning against this Armed Forces Special Powers Act for the last 20 years. I have spoken out on human rights abuses in Kashmir or other places in the Northeast, etc. for the last 15 years. Now I can't stop speaking about other issues, other important issues which concern public welfare in the country, merely because I am part of Team Anna. It is not neither desirable nor possible to expect me to now just clam up on all other issues and just focus on this corruption or this Jan bill. So therefore, those differences are there, they are bound to be there. However, on this issue of corruption, we are together on the issue of the Lokpal bill.
The thing is, there is a timing of every statement. When you have only 2 months in hand, when people should have been united, don't you think people should have been a little more cautious about giving out statements? Completely. People have their own ideology, people have their own feelings about
For
it.
example, Vidha Patkar, who is a member of the core committee, is right now on a yatra from Kashmir to Manipur on the issue of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Now, how can you expect, she is also a member of the core committee and a member of Team Anna, though not as visible a member, face of Team Anna as I am. How can you expect, she has been engaged in a very large number of public issues such as displacement of people by dams, land acquisition, SEZs, everything. So she is bound to, whenever any issue arises, whenever any need arises to speak out about those issues, she is bound to speak out about them. Now, other members of the team may not agree with her views on those issues, but that does not mean that she should not speak about those issues while this, we don't know whether the Lokpal bill will be passed during the winter session or not. Even if it is passed, if it is a hopeless bill, the campaign will go on for a long time. That does not mean that all of us can freeze, put everything else in freeze, all the other issues in freeze. After all, Lokpal is only a means to an end, and the end is to create a more just and humane society. Lokpal bill is not an end in itself. You cannot, in order to achieve the Lokpal bill, you cannot sacrifice the other issues which are also essential for creating a more just and humane society.
Why don't you take that? Go ahead.
So you talk about legitimization of corruption, and that strikes a chord because I'm from Assam, and the whole state sort of accepts corruption as a way of life. So
Create a revolution.
Go ahead.
What might the role be of Indians living abroad in these developments?
Yeah, there are at least 3 kinds of roles that I can think of, but I'm sure there could be others. One needs to think more creatively. One is that even if Indians NRIs living abroad were to get together in groups and associations, understand these important, seek to understand what's happening in India by not just from the surface. See, from the surface, from the media, you get one picture, but as I said, that picture can be often very misleading. You need to have a deeper understanding of what's really going on, and for that deeper understanding, people need to either go there on proper study tours and just spend some time with the organizations and individuals working on important issues in the fields, or in invite those people who are working there to talk to people here to find out and have a good appreciation of what happened. And then raise their voices in a collective manner on those issues. Because though you may not even have votes today, but the voice of NRIs of North America at any rate is an influential voice. If it is raised collectively, it will be heard by the elitist governments in India at any rate. Secondly, you can help those individuals and organizations, financially or otherwise, who are working on issues of public importance, who are doing good work on issues of public importance. Thirdly, people here I have found during this trip, particularly the kind of people that I have met from various organizations, including IDS, including Indians for Collective Action, including there are a number of good organizations which have formed here. Friends of Loksatta, People for Loksatta, sorry. Then you have Foundation for Democratic Reforms in India. There are many organizations which have attracted some very, very intelligent, thoughtful, committed, sober, sensible people. If they, for example, this whole model of participatory democracy, this needs to be thought through all its problems, potential problems, what are the experiences of various other countries, the states in the US and so on. All that needs to be pooled together to propose a properly workable model of participatory democracy. They could help in doing that as well. And then they could do what Professor Mr. Paul Pollack, who was also honored by the Indians for Collective Action recently, the kind of appropriate technology that he is developing for which can be used by the common people there. Those kind of inexpensive water pumps. So one has to see what are the needs of the common people there, what kind of technologies could be developed to help those people. And there are lots of Indians who are involved in technology here. So not just information technology, but other also. They could help in doing that. But the main thing is that we need a serious engagement first. The first prerequisite is a serious engagement in what is happening in India. People need to really be prepared to spend some of their time. Some of those people, for example, have decided to go to India to help this India Against Corruption office there to streamline it so that it is able, there are better systems of communication established, better systems of responding to feedback, etc. That kind of serious engagement in this.
Well, it was in fact my question actually that you asked, so that's fine. So I would like to ask you another question. I'm sure you are aware that Kiran Bediji was there in Chicago a couple of months ago, and there was a lot of discussion. One point of discussion was exactly this, and she also had some suggestions as to what should be the role of these NRIs or forming different kind of organization. But in that context, she was also asked a question that this IAC, do they intend to participate with other organizations in India who are fighting against corruption, with special reference to the movement that Ramdev is organizing. And at that time she mentioned the time hasn't come because the wound is very raw, etc., and that movement has made a couple of statements which is against the principle of the IAC, etc. Now a couple of months have passed, and what is the stand of IAC in reference to joining hands with other movements with special reference to Baba Ramdev?
So it was decided firstly that IAC would not associate with any political party. Secondly, I think a kind of a tactical decision was also taken to not to function jointly with Baba Ramdev and his organization. There are problems which we have seen with that. So therefore, that was a tactical decision which has been taken.
Last question, we need to wrap it up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of interest, as you know, abroad of what is happening in Delhi these days with London. Is it possible for some NRI to actually participate in the operations of the team so that they can learn from what is happening and maybe bring the lessons of team to, let's say, the Occupy Wall Street movement all across the world? Because I think there is definitely connections to be made and lessons can be brought back and forth between the two movements.
That should be possible. One will have to talk to the people who are operationally running the office there, that is Arvind Kejriwal and his group, who are really in charge of running the organization and the office. They would be in a better position to respond to that, but I think it should be possible.
Okay, thank you.